GLGY. Hi, I'm Boyd Hawkins. Did you know that approximately 40% of all bird species are migratory? This means that the birds travel from one distinct geographic location to another over the course of a year. These events are usually referred to as spring and fall migration. In the northern regions, birds tend to migrate from regions of lower latitude in the winter up to regions of higher latitude in the summer. By changing their position on the globe, birds can remain in regions with abundant resources year-round. Take the snowy owl, for example. This little guy spends the winters in Alberta, Canada, and spring migrates back to Greenland for the summer, where he lives and breeds. The harsh winters of the far north would be too much for even a snowy owl, but the Canadian prairies offer a nice winter refuge for him. During his summer months in the northern regions of Greenland, the snowy owl lives and breeds and produces offspring, which, come fall migration, must be ready to fly south into Canada. The timing of the snowy owl's migration back north to his summer breeding grounds is key in terms of maximizing the availability of resources, nesting sites, and potential mates. We're rolling? Oh. Unfortunately, bird migration isn't actually that well understood, and different bird species respond to different kinds of changes in Earth systems. Birds respond to things like changes in temperature, changes in resource availability, and even changes in levels of sunlight. All of these provide the birds with an indication of a relative timing of when to migrate. Given the way that birds respond to changes in Earth's seasonality, it's reasonable to assume that they'll also respond to changes in Earth's climate. Scientific studies in this area are still ongoing, especially given how many bird species there are, and given the evolving nature of climate change itself. One of the most difficult aspects of calculating bird migration patterns is keeping track of the birds themselves. There are so many bird species and only so few researchers on any given project. So how can one team of researchers collect enough data to calculate all these different bird migration patterns? One team of researchers has turned to a method known as citizen science to help solve this problem. Citizen science is the method of using crowdsourced data collected by average citizens like you and me, and using that data for scientific purposes. The Cornell Laboratory of Ornithology and the National Audubon Society have partnered with a website known as eBird, where amateur birders can report their bird sightings for any given location worldwide. This database allows for researchers to accurately map the timing of bird migration across vast distances and with a high number of samples so that any errors can be accounted for. A recent study based in the eastern United States analyzed the bird migration patterns of 18 different species, including the rose-breasted grosbeak, Baltimore oriole, and eastern kingbird. This study collected data on the timing of spring migration for these species and how that changes relative to temperature. It was found that for all 18 species, they arrived around 0.8 days earlier per degree Celsius of warming. This means that for every degree that climate change and greenhouse gases warm the Earth, birds will, on average, arrive to their breeding grounds 0.8 days earlier than normal. So by the year 2100, when temperatures are expected to be around 5 degrees warmer than today, the birds will arrive about 4 days earlier than normal. That's not a lot. I mean, really, would anyone even notice? The birds arrive 4 days early. Does anyone care? It's not a big deal. Or is it? You see, all this gets a little tricky when we really start to look at the finer details of it all. Yes, birds are only going to arrive a few days earlier on average, but when we start to look at more isolated communities, such as just a state or a county, we can start to see some pretty worrying trends. Some birds, such as the red-eyed vireo, indigo bunting, and great crested flycatcher, started to arrive in some northern regions as many as 6 days earlier per degree of warming. If we compare that to our current climate change projections, by 2100, these birds could be arriving as much as a month earlier than they should be. Let's take a closer look at the indigo bunting. The indigo bunting spends her winter months in Central America and flies north up and along the Appalachian Mountains into the Great Lakes region for summer and breeding. But what happens if she arrives in New York or Chicago a month earlier than she should usually, in March instead of April? But just because the temperatures are higher in this region, it doesn't mean that there will be the resources needed to support the indigo bunting or her family's lifestyle. Sunlight levels will still be low, the vegetation needed for the birds may be scarce. As well, if all the indigo buntings aren't arriving in relative unison, then there might not be enough potential mates to go around at any given time. Scientists have found that birds that migrate slowly, or otherwise only travel short distances, tend to adapt the most to climate change, whereas bird species that migrate to high, northerly latitudes tend to respond the least to climate change. The only thing more worrying than bird migration patterns being heavily altered is when bird migration patterns don't change at all, despite changes in climate and temperature. The rose-breasted grosbeak, who lives for the winter in Colombia and flies north all the way up to northern Canada for breeding in the summer, was found to not change his timing of migration at all. If anything, he started arriving later than usual. Now, this is a concern because, with changing temperature and climate, the timing of resource availability is bound to shift as well, and thus, we don't want the rose-breasted grosbeak arriving at a time when resources aren't most abundant. It has been found that birds that don't adapt their migration timing to a changing climate are found to have reduced offspring count as well as reduced offspring size. The truth is that we still don't know exactly how birds will or even should appropriately respond to climate change, and even so, every species responds differently. Some species over-adapt to the effects of climate change, and some species don't adapt at all. Neither of these scenarios is ideal. The best thing you can do to help out is to report your bird sightings on eBird, especially during spring migration, which is in March to April. This will help researchers establish a database on bird migration and will help to identify species that have advanced risks of becoming endangered from climate change.
I can't look at the rocket launch, the trophy wives of the astronauts, and I won't listen to their words, 'cause I like birds.